there, Jean Truelove from Truelove Quilts for You, coming from an isolated sewing room. I personally have not been out of my house for one solid week. I had a little tickle in my throat, as some of you knew, and it's nothing, maybe allergies, although I don't think I have allergies, but whatever it is, I'm not going out of my house. The Maxwell is home also. Our children have shut down their businesses. My husband works for my one son and also has his own business, and he's stopped. We're okay for a little while with this COVID-19 virus, the coronavirus. It's terrible, terrible. And I just wanted to, before I showed you my finished quilt, that's what I'm doing. I finished my sampler quilt, but I just wanted to ask you, if people are watching this video, what your thoughts are on DIY homemade masks at this stage of the game. For not preventing the virus, obviously it's not for preventing the virus. There's so many conflicting reports, because I've had a couple people say, oh Jean, make some masks. And then you have, like, I'm a registered nurse, don't do it. Doctors say it's no good. It's obviously, then you have the other side of the coin, it's better than nothing, which I would think it's better than nothing. But then there's the whole thing, well, it gives you a false sense of security. I don't know what to think, but I just did some research. Again, is it a valid research thing? I think it was, whatever it was on the internet. Testing very, very stringent tests for DIY fabric masks as opposed to surgical masks, as opposed to the ones with the filters, the N95. I believe that's my husband has. My son, for his work, had gotten quite a few before, and has given my husband several. My husband has not gone out of this house without a mask and safety goggles, because it's imperative that he gets to just 1 or 2 jobs, but pretty much he's staying at home. But when he does, he's kitted out. But then one of the researchers was like, even a bandana is better than nothing. But then that whole no. So it's a very gray area. But some of the research was showing that in these stringent tests, that 50%, the masks with the microns, whatever it is, did like 80% protection. The fabric masks was 50%. Well, I'm thinking, based on those findings, I'm thinking, well, that is better than nothing. That is absolutely better than nothing. When you see where the virus originated in China, in the Asian countries, that the entire population is wearing a mask. Yes, are they most probably rated higher? Obviously, but now the masks are not to be found. The masks are gone. They are not available. So I think, well, the whole better than nothing, I think that makes sense personally, myself. So I might be doing a video next on a few DIY masks. And again, if it's a false sense of security, don't have a go at me, because people are panicking. I'm keeping calm, trying to keep, I have a picture, keep calm and quilt on, right? I always think, what if people don't have a hobby? You're staying at home. And I addressed the other day, I had this nervous energy. Well, of course, somebody says, why are you nervous? I'm like, hello, the world is nervous. But we're trying to keep everything in perspective. We understand what is going on and why it's going on. And it's just an interesting time of the time that we are living in. Very, very fascinating, interesting times that we're living in. So I think I'm going to test the waters, and I'm going to try to make some masks. If not just for my own self, my members of our family are like, oh Mom, why don't you make some? So I'm going to experiment, and I just might video that. But that's for that. I just hope everybody is staying safe, and it's such a carte blanche statement. Hey, stay safe, stay indoors. Well, what if you can't? I'm blessed enough to be able to not go out of the house. I've been getting sunshine. We're doing tours around our home. We have no neighbors. But what if you have to go to work? It's sort of like, poor people. I understand why there's a panic. People's wages and people's jobs. So anyway, but whatever you can do to take care of yourselves, and social distancing 6 feet apart around the, I was looking at some newscasts, and around the world there literally people are standing in line 6 foot apart. Whatever we can do, we have to be socially responsible. I know there's kids on spring break in Florida. That was a disaster. I'm thinking, oh, whatever. Please just be aware, be careful, and do what you can. Frequent hand washing. I'm washing my hands like no one's business. I go on my computer, I wash my hands. I go sew something, I wash my hands. Maxwell also is understanding the enormity of this entire situation, and nothing to be messing about with. That's what I say. But I have finished my quilt. I have finished my sampler quilt that I've been working on forever, it seems, right? And I put the binding on, and my last tutorial, I was showing you how I chose the binding, my black and white, sort of like a stylized spot. So this here is my finished sampler quilt. I have been working on it for quite a few months. This was a quilt along, a block of the month club, and I have finished it. I am very pleased. My floor is clean, and I will wash my quilt. With quite a few people said, oh, you know, do you wash your quilts? I'm like, well, yeah, I will use about 6 or 7 color catchers in my first washing, and probably they'll turn out a bit pink if some of the fabrics. But I've color tested most of these fabrics, and my color catchers, I use Carvana color catchers. It's a microfiber. Shout has a color catcher, and they say 1 or 2. I use like 6 or 7 of them. I have never had an issue with my fabrics running. Tell a lie, and I told you this ages ago, ages and ages ago. I had used, when I first started quilting, a red fabric that was old. And remember, I was pulling from my fabric. It was old, and it was I used it with, what did I use it with? Well, anyway, my entire quilt ended up a very pretty shade of pink. I could care less. I'm like, oh well, never mind. Live and learn. And it was real pretty. It was real pretty. I gifted that to someone. They're like, oh, what a pretty pink quilt. You know, there's more pressing things to worry about than your fabric running. But I'm not discounting that. People spend a lot of money and time and effort to make a quilt. So you want to be careful, and I am, especially with red and white. So this is my finished quilt. This is my backing. This is my binding. The tutorial to follow this little video introduction here is how I bound my quilt with a straight grain binding, but on a curved corner. I curve the corners of all my quilts. If you've been following me, you will know that. I do not make a straight corner with a mitered binding like a frame. I don't do that. That's just my personal preference. If you want to finish your quilt with a straight on with a mitered binding, tons of good tutorials on YouTube. I curve my corners with my straight grain binding, and then I show you how to do that in the video, the next few minutes to follow. So here is my finished quilt. I'm thrilled with it. It's just so pretty. My black backing with my red and pink roses. And I like the binding that I chose, just a slightly different, just a little bit different to add just a little tiny bit of punch to the outside. I do my binding at 2 1/4 inches. I think I've mentioned that before. And so there's my finished quilt. It's the end of the road for Jean's Block Party 2019. Am I going to be doing a Block Party 2020? I'm not quite sure at this moment in time. I'm not quite sure. I have to put my thinking cap on, think about what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be doing again some special tutorials just for smaller projects for my patrons on my Patreon account. What happens is on that I do a tutorial, I make a project, and then I randomly choose a winner of that project and I send them what I made. It's just an incentive because they've been so kind to leave me a monetary tip, as it were, in my tip jar on my patrons. So I'm going to be doing those videos as well as these here on YouTube. So I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do. We're trying to ride this health scare, this epidemic, pandemic out. See what the near future holds for all of us. Again, it's scary times, but we are comforted to know why it's happening. And yeah, so I just wanted to let you know that this video is up now. I've finished my quilt, and I hope you enjoy the binding tutorial to follow. And again, stay safe, stay away, wash your hands. All right, folks, I'm going to go wash my hands now. See you later. Bye. I'm videoing. So I'm now going to be cutting my binding for my sampler quilt. And if you've been following along, you know that I love my Fiskars ruler. It's a rotary cutter ruler, 6" by 24" ruler. I have neatened up the edge of my fabric here that I'm using for my binding, straighten that all up, and I'm going to be, I put this fabric selvage to selvage and then folded it in half, nice and neat. This is just a remnant. I think I have enough. Oh, there's my phone. I have enough fabric here. So what I do is I have used, if you're just following along, I always use 2 rulers to cut my fabrics, and I'm just using a small ruler this time. I use basically my Fiskars ruler, or sometimes I will use my Olfa, my lip edge ruler, which has a nice, this is an older one. It has a lovely lip that catches the edge of my mat. But in this case, I'm using my Fiskars, and I'm using an OmniGrid. This is just a 6" square ruler. And now, what I do is I find my marking on my ruler. I cut my bindings at 2 1/4. A lot of people cut their bindings 2 1/2. I don't. I cut my bindings so that they're fairly small and they're very, very concise on my quilt. Now, as you know, I am doing a rounded corner on my quilt here, and you might think, well, you need, the general rule is you would have to use a bias going across the bias edge of let me get rid of this, of the fabric to go around a curved corner. I don't need to do that, and as I have other videos that show that I don't need to do that, but I will show you in depth in this video how I use a straight grain binding around a curved corner. I find my marking at 2 1/4 on my second ruler, and I butt it up to this edge here. There's my 2 1/4, and there's my 2 1/4. If I had a long length of fabric that I was cutting, I would use a longer ruler. I would use a longer ruler with a marking, and then I would go up there and find the marking, and I would go down here onto the fabric. So here's my 2 1/4, and there's my 2 1/4 marking there. I make sure that my Fiskars ruler is lined up, these lovely lines, on the lines of my Martelli cutting mat, which I've spoken about, I love. So everything is lovely and square. Now what you do is with my hand, you just push down, the rotary cutter blade is hidden underneath, and it's along this line here that my ruler has been butted up against, that it's a perfect 2 1/4 inch strip that I will cut. I just do that, and there's my 2 1/4 inch strip. I will just continue butting up my ruler, my second ruler, with my 2 1/4, coming back, pushing down, and cutting. Everybody says, oh my word, your ruler is the bomb, and it is just fantastic. I highly recommend the Fiskars ruler here. As you can see, my 2 1/4 inch, I can cut 2 1/4 inch strips. And let me tell you, I mean, I have had most people who I've recommended this ruler to love it. But some people say they don't love it, which is fine. I've had this ruler for about 4 years now. I have never changed the blade. I have never ever changed the blade, the rotary cutter blade in my Fiskars ruler. This has been a brilliant, absolutely brilliant ruler. I'm just going to continue cutting my strips. Now my quilt is about, I measured it, this is about 40 inches, I go by 40. I need about 9 of these strips. This was just an offcut of fabric, but I know that I can get about 8 or 9, maybe I'll cut 10. I'm not sure because I always err on the cautious side, as you know. Maybe I'll cut, well, whatever it is, probably 9, because now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my fabric to make a long continuous bias strip. I'm going to do it at this angle, whatever this angle is. What is this angle? 45-degree angle? What I'm going to do is I'm going to do it like this, okay? I always put it a little bit up there because this is a selvage. That's a selvage, and we don't want to include that there. So putting it nice and straight, I'll take it over to my machine. You can pin it. I'm going to sew from this point here, that corner, over to that corner. And then when it's nice and sewn, you have a lovely long strip, and then you obviously just cut that off. And then you won't have the bulk if in this seam, if you had sewn these edges together like that, you wouldn't have the bulk of this seam to doing it on the diagonal. So I'm going to cut these and I'm going to sew them, and I'll meet you over at my machine. So right now I'm making my long binding strips, and what I have here is I've set this out perfectly horizontal to my sewing machine, on my sewing machine, and because this edge and this edge here are a selvage edge, they're a selvage, I don't want to include them in my anywhere in my seam here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shift that up just slightly there, and if you wish, you can put a pin in here, because what we're going to be doing is having this extremely, whatever angle that is, I don't know what the angle that is, we're going to be sewing from this corner here to this corner here, and you can eyeball it. What you want to do is you just want to shift your fabric, your 2 strips. You want to start right in that corner, right in the corner there, and you're going to eyeball it. Just go slow right down to this corner here. And then we're going to make sure, before you trim anything, make sure that your strip is nice and level, even, horizontal. And then you're going to trim that seam to 1/4 inch. You can just eyeball that and trim off those little dog ears if you have them. And again, they're going to end up with a nice biased seam there that gets really hidden. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, I'm going to finish making my long strip, my long binding strips. I'm going to take this over to my ironing board. I'm going to press these seams here one way or the other, and then I'm going to press it really well, and then I'm going to fold this binding strip in half. Fold that in half, and I'm going to press that really, really well, folding my binding strip in half. I won't show you how to do that because that's an easy step. Just make sure you press these seams, these bias seams to one side, and then find exactly the half raw edges together and press that in half. So I have pressed my binding in half really, really well, and I brought my quilt over. And starting from, here's my curved edge at the top here, starting from about, I don't know, 15 inches or so down from the side, whichever side, I'm going to leave about 6 or 7 inches of tail from my binding. You see that? Let me see if I'm in the, let me just see, yeah. Yeah, 6 or 7 inches of tail. And then I'm going to start stitching this down. And if you remember, we have sewn the binding, the backing, the front, the back, the batting and the back. We've stitched that together. So I've cut that to about maybe a little bit over 1/8 of an inch. So a little bit over 1/4 of an inch away. I will start, and I'm going to back stitch this here. And this is with the raw edges. The folded edges are out here. I'm stitching this onto the back of my quilt. Now I'm being very careful to keep my fabric nice and my quilt sandwich nice and loose, and also I'm being very careful to keep my binding loose. I'm not pulling my binding in any respect, way, shape, or form. I'm laying it very, very loosely onto my quilt. I'm just laying it loosely. I have my quilt loose, my fabric loose, and the binding loose. Again, this is to the back side of my quilt, matching these edges. Sometimes people like to put their binding around a spool or a pin or something. I just have mine loose here to the right side of my machine. Now there's a little bit of a dog ear on that binding. I'm just going to trim off. And I'll just continue keeping my binding nice and loose. That was at the seam, which I've pressed to one side. Again, I'm making sure that my quilt is nice and loose right next to me, to the left of me. And I'm just putting this binding on the edge. Now, I'm coming to the corner of my quilt, my rounded corner. And again, very, very loose, keeping it nice and straight behind my needle. Making sure I keep that 1/4 of an inch. Now, as you can see, let me just see here, yeah. You can see, here's my cornered, my rounded corner. This is a straight grain binding. It is not on the bias. What I do is I have enough of it here to the right side of my machine, my binding. From about this point on, about 5 inches or so, 4 or 5 inches up from my corner, which would have been, my corner would have been here, about 6 inches up, I just very, very loosely, again, keeping everything nice and square, I'm keeping this so loose, almost to the point, stitch by stitch, I'm almost like pushing it back without making tucks, back under, making it so loose, I'm sort of pushing it back under my presser foot, because it's so loose. Because people who have watched me before realize if you pull on this, you go to turn it, it will turn, but your corners will cup up. It won't lay flat. It won't lay flat on a curve. It will cup on the curve. So this point here, with my straight grain binding, you have to keep it extremely loose. And the biggest part is to keep it extremely your 1/4 inch. Your tendency is to either go in on your stitching or to go narrow on your stitching. You have to be consistent, keeping this edge very, very, making sure that that binding edge is right on that loose, on the corner. Again, you can do this sort of stitch by stitch, and as you, again, you've seen other videos of me, I sort of keep my fingers this way and I sort of hold it stitch by stitch, pushing it almost back under my presser foot. My hands are in the way a bit, but now I'm coming to the curve. I'm coming to this real curve. Now, if you might get, literally, you might get a tuck or two. Now, you don't want to get a tuck like that, obviously. But if you get a little tiny pinch of fabric, it's okay. Just make sure that your binding is lovely and loose, keeping your 1/4 inch, keeping your edges of your binding and your quilt nice. This is the point. Now I'm going to go stitch by stitch because I'm going to have to turn. I'm going to leave my needle down and I'm just going to turn this just ever so slightly. Don't rush this part at all. You see that? Just pushing that right under there, keeping my edges perfectly matched and keeping my 1/4 inch perfectly aligned. And again, coming out of the curve, you can see, as you can see, I'm almost pushing this fabric back under my presser foot. I'm not, but it's getting to that point. So I'm going to just continue this on. Oh, my battery's running out. I'm just going to continue this on and I'll show you my next one. So yeah, here I am back. Sorry, I had to change my battery. Okay, oh, let me just get this, my foot pedal. My tripod is in the way. Oh, okay, so I'm just on this first curve, and as you can see, again, I'm almost pushing that binding underneath that presser foot, keeping it so loose, because people are like, what? You know, surely you need to have a biased binding, which a bias, of course, stretches. I'm like, no, I don't. So what I'm going to do, here's another little thread. Oh, look, I got a little bit of a tuck. Huh, who cares? I always say, oh, I never get tucks. I got a tuck. It's funny. Yeah, there you go. And so, again, now I'm pretty well away from that. I'm away from that corner. So now I can just go along and keep my edges nice. But I want to see for my own, let me just see for my own perusal here, how this is going to look. So there's the back side of it, and then I turn it around. I might have it to trim that little bit of away. So here is my curve. As you can see, when I go to stitch it down, how lovely, with a little bit of like stitch by stitch, bite by bite, how that will just curve beautifully when I go to stitch that. As you can see, it's very, very important to keep your 1/4 inch all the way around that curve, so you don't go bigger, and you don't go smaller. You don't have enough like that. You want to keep that perfectly consistent right around your curve. But I'll show you that when I get to it. So now I'm going to come down my straightaway. My binding is lovely and loose. I'm not pulling it at all. I can go faster, but I guarantee you my binding is so nice and loose. Because you pull it all, and you're going to have a stretched out, you know, mess of a binding. It's lovely and loose. Again, my leg is right under the tripod. I'm sort of sitting sideways. It is so important to sit, I always say this, you're going to get fed up with me saying it. It's so important to sit right in front of your needle. The front of your body, or your body's right in front of your needle. And I'm slightly off center, and boy, it's funny, I'm sort of stretching my leg. Now, here I am. I'm coming to my corner of my quilt, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to just, from this point on, just lay it. keeping my 1/4 of an inch, and then just seriously, I have to bring my leg, I got to bring my presser foot closer. There we go. Just lay it and then almost push it. Relax that right around there. Relax it. And again, don't rush this point. Don't rush this part. See how I'm keeping this, my 1/4 inch consistent right around this curve. Right, and keeping my fabric right on that, right on the, keeping the edges completely matched up. Because it would be very easy to do that. It would be very easy to sort of do that. But this is where it's important to get your rounded edges. Very important to keep the stitch consistent, the stitch length, the stitch width consistent. And then just the relaxed fabric. Got to pull out a bit more binding here for myself. And I think I'll just turn it just slightly, put my presser foot down. And there's a little tuck, but that's okay. Presser foot down, needle down. And then just keeping it on the edge. I like to keep everything right straight in front of me. So if you have to adjust it with your needle down, needle in, press your foot down. You're still about 6 or 7 inches from the end. You still want to keep it nice and loose. And then from about there, you are then on your straightaway, and you can go and you can do your next, laying it nice enough loose, you can do your next 2 corners. And then I'll be back to show you how I join my binding together. So I finished up my putting the binding on. I just wanted to show you, this is, oops, there's a little bit of a dog ear there from that piece I didn't see as I was sewing it. Just take that little dog ear off your binding. Now this is my last corner that I just did, and I want to show you how very consistent, if you can see that, where I cut that corner, how very consistent I kept my 1/4 inch and my 1/4 inch of my binding there. Very important. So then when I go to turn it around, which will be the next step, there's the back of my binding, and then I smooth it, pulling it around. I'll show you that the next step. That how easily you can see that, how easily keeping that 1/4 of an inch, when I go to stitch it stitch by stitch, that I can get that round curve there without using a bias. And I'll be very careful to stitch it on the outside, just stitch by stitch. If I get a tiny little tuck, I'm not bothered by that. But mostly of the time, it just turns beautifully, as you can see. It looks as lovely on the front as it does on the back. I quite like this black and white, actually. But now, I digress. I'm moving ahead. I have my let me just put this here. Let me just see. Yeah, I have my long piece here, and I'm just going to cut off. I know I have tons of space there. I'm just going to cut off a piece of my binding from my one edge. And I do know, again, I've done binding tutorials before, I do know that this is 2 1/4 inches, okay? Now, I'm going to just check, make this all nice and flat. I'm going to check that I have enough, which I obviously do. Now, I left, remember, about 6 inches of binding here. I'm just going to cut that off, the bottom one, I'm going to cut it off about 1.5 inches or so. And I'm going to put a pin. We're joining this binding piece together. I'm going to put a pin on the bottom here of this binding strip, okay? Put a pin going this way, all right? That's the bottom. Now I have this piece here. okay? And that's, I have plenty to go. Now we are going to be joining up this binding top here to this binding strip here the exact way. Let me just see if I have an extra piece. The exact way, do I have it with the seam on it? Yes. Okay, here's an extra piece of binding that I had cut off. The exact way using this bias seam. Remember we did that bias seam there. Put our fabrics at an angle. What is that angle? I don't know what that angle is. So anyway, so this is I have my extra piece here, my top piece here. Now I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to lift this one up and I'm going to place this one right on the edge of that binding that's pinned down, okay? I'll put that right on the edge. I'm going to place this piece right on top, smoothing it, not pulling it, just laying that there. Now, checking it again, that's right on the edge of that piece there. And then, you be brave, I'm going to cut my top binding, my top bit, right the same size as this piece here. Oops, maybe I will put a pin on there. Put an extra pin just to be sure. So now, this is just laid nice and loose. I'm going to take this top binding and cut it the exact size of my sort of spacer piece, okay? Now, I'm going to take out my 2 pins. Put this to the side. Now, I'm going to turn my quilt sandwich. Again, it's going to be facing me right in front of me. Now we are going to join these 2 binding pieces, which we have quite a lot, which I'm quite pleased. You see that? You see how much we have? So I don't have to mess too much. We're going to take the top binding piece that we have there, and we're going to lay it exactly as we would when we made our binding originally. We're going to put it this way. We have plenty here. And we're going to unfold it, so the fold's in the middle, as you can see. We're going to take our other piece, our bottom piece, and we're going to do it exactly like we did with that when we did our binding when we made it. Okay, you're going to bring this sort of up. I'm just trying to see if I'm in the, yeah, I'm in the, and you're going to take this piece here, and with the right sides, the pretty sides together, you're going to put them just like we did. Just like we did. It takes a little bit of scrunching because they're attached and the other bits weren't attached. We're going to put it at this angle, remember? I'm going to put a pin there. I actually might put 2 pins there because this can pull, the bit in your, that's already sewn down can pull a bit. I could have allowed myself a little bit more, but I'm good with that. I'm going to put 2 pins there, right? Now, I'm going to hold that. And what are we going to do? We're going to stitch, just like we did our binding when we constructed it. We're going to stitch from this corner there down to that corner there. You see that? We're going to stitch right down. I'm going to put my needle down, press the foot down, go slowly. Keep this lovely and loose, your quilt sandwich. Hold it tightly, and then eyeball it. Oops. We're going to just stitch that on that diagonal from that corner to this corner here. Okay, just go slowly. I can see my corner underneath. Take my needle out. I can see my corner, and I'm just going to go right to the end and off. Reach around here. I'm having to reach around my tripod now. Before we trim anything off, obviously you're going to see if, your binding will fit on the edge of your quilt. Even with this big lump here, right? So now I've pulled my binding out, and there my binding fits beautifully along the edge there with a lovely mitered seam, just like my others. So now I know it fits. I'm going to pull it out, make sure I don't cut away anything other than the binding itself, to 1/4 of an inch. And then I'm going to finger press that whichever way. Pull it along. Go back to where I stopped stitching on my straightaway. And you can see it fits beautifully. A little bit of a back stitch. There's my seam that we just stitched. And my binding fits beautifully. Little pucker there, that's fine. And then my binding is attached all the way around my quilt. Now I'm going to come down. This is the fun part, but you have to be brave if you haven't done it before. I'm going to come out. I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to find my. I'm going to come about whichever edge. I'm going to come about 7 or 8 inches from the top of whatever side, and I'm going to start pulling my binding out this way. I'm not going to pull it towards me. I'm going to pull it to the right. Okay, get all my threads away. And I'm going to lift it right over. I'm not trimming anything because this has already been trimmed. I'm going to pull it right over that seam, that raw edge there, having it nice and pulled out from the back. And then this is where a nice precision, which if you go slowly, you can stitch it right along the edge. Machine stitch it right along the edge. People who have been following me know I hate to hand sew. Let me just see if I can get a little bit closer. I don't think I can. My tripod's in the way. Anyway, you can see this. So I'm just pulling it out nice and tucking all those threads in if there are any, pulling it out gently and just folding it over. And because we trim that like that to 1/8 of an inch and then this to 1/4 inch, this 2 1/4 inch binding just folds over beautifully. It's not too big, it's not too small. And I would just start stitching right towards the edge. And this is where you do have to have, like, if you're used to, quote, top stitching, this is where your neat stitching comes in. I find it imperative to keep the quilt right in front of you. And again, I'm sitting upright. I'm looking down at my machine. I'm not going up to my machine. I'm sitting higher in my chair. So you can see that rolls right over. I'm encasing my quilt sandwich beautifully. My quilt is going right to the edge of the binding. There's no loose flappy flap bit of binding. It's enclosed beautifully. I'm just going slow. Right along, catching that edge. Now, people will say to me, well, what does the back look like? You know, oh my goodness, because I hand sew, I stitch to the front and hand sew to the back. Well, I'll show you in just a minute. As you've known, I've done other binding tutorials. I'm not bothered that I can actually see, come along here, I can actually see my stitches, my binding stitch on the back there. I am so not bothered with that. It's a nice, straight, even stitch. To me, it looks almost professional because it's machined. It's nice and sturdy, and I've said it 1,000 times. There's no way that my hand stitching, which if I put my mind to it, I'm sure I could do it neat and tidy. I'm not an idiot, but I don't like to. I like to use my machine stitch because I think it's just stronger and sturdier than any hand sewing that I could do. You hand sewers, more power to you. A lot of people like the idea of sitting of an evening time binding their quilts. It's lovely. We have a very busy schedule myself, so I don't do that. And as you can see, here's my binding. It's turning out beautifully. There's the back. Here's the front. Now I'm sure you're all anxious to see me get to a corner, so I will hurry up here. I'm folding and tucking. I'm just folding, keeping it all nice in front of me, pulling this out, going right to the corner of that quilt sandwich, right to the edge, I should say, of the quilt sandwich. And I'll roll that right over. I have bound over 400 quilts, so I can do it quite quickly. But by all means, take your time. Especially if you're not used to sewing close to the edge of somewhere, of something. Because you want to get as close to the edge as possible to make a neat, tidy binding. So if you go a bit slower. Now I'm coming to the edge, my rounded corner, and now we will see if all of my relaxing and making sure that my edges were all straight work. So I'm turning this over. Again, my hands are in the way. Now what I will do is I'll bring this binding towards me. I'll sort of cup it. Let me just see if I can. Yeah, I'll just sort of cup it like this. Pull that right there. Let me just see. Yeah, like that. Everything is perfectly straight in front of me and perfectly. Is this horizontal? This is vertical. This is horizontal. And I'm seeing that this binding just curves right around that corner. You see that? It's going to need a little bit of nudging. So I'm coming down this straight away to my binding corner. I'm not pulling it this way. I'm not pulling it little. I'm keeping that 1/4 of an inch right around that, right around there. Holding it with my fingers. Again, go slowly because you want to just bite by bite. Keeping it the exact same width. Secure your rounded corners down. Needle down, adjust my fabric, and then continue. And there is my rounded corner. There's my rounded corner right there. I've made sure that the quilt sandwich is right in the edge there. It's filled, my binding is filled. It's beautifully rounded. It's a nice soft edge, which I like. It's machined. If you do get a tuck or two, don't fret that. Don't worry about it. You probably will when you first start doing this. But again, it just takes some practice to keep this stitching neat. And if you do happen to go off, then just come back and just re-stitch it down. It's fine. Now, if you make 2.5 inch binding, then your binding obviously will be, say you make 2.5 inch binding, your binding will be bigger, say like that. So you might be coming like that. Your binding might be bigger when you turn it. I like my 2.25 inch. You have to be a bit more precise, but I like the way that my binding ends up looking on my quilts. There's the back. Remember, we went through the choosing process. I went through the choosing process of choosing this black binding. I love it on the back. I think it's happy, and I like that little expected touch on the front. So I'm going to finish my quilt, and then you will have seen it finished. So there's my binding. This is almost a year in the doing. My lovely sampler quilt. If you're following along. Jean's Block Party 2019. I don't know what I'm going to do for 2020. But thank you for following along, and all you people who have made your sampler quilt, more power to you. And I hope you beginners will try to follow along and make a beautiful sampler quilt, block by block. I hope you've enjoyed it, folks. Thank you. Bye.